It was April 14th, 1945. The roads of central Germany were choked with American armour, a steel river flowing east toward Berlin. Just outside the shattered town of Urfort, Technical Sergeant Michael "Mike" Anthony Romano crouched beside a smoking M4 Sherman tank, his hands black with oil, his face streaked with grime and exhaustion. The tank's engine had seized, locked solid. The oil had turned to sludge from weeks of constant operation, no time for proper maintenance, no time for anything except push forward, keep moving, get to Berlin before the Russians. Standard procedure said this tank needed a full engine teardown. 4 hours minimum, maybe 6. The battalion had 127 tanks. 43 of them were showing oil degradation, engines running hot, bearings grinding. And General George S. Patton's Third Army was 48 hours from Berlin, racing against time, against the Soviets, against the end of the war. Every tank that stopped was a tank that wouldn't make it. Every hour of maintenance was an hour the enemy used to regroup. Mike's battalion commander stood over him, furious. "I need this tank operational in 30 minutes, Sergeant, or leave it." Mike looked at the engine, at the seized pistons, at the sludge that should have been oil. And then he did something no maintenance manual had ever described, something every army mechanic had been explicitly forbidden to try. He grabbed a cutting torch, a drain pan, and a jerry can of fresh oil, and performed a complete oil system flush and swap in 3 minutes flat. No cooling period, no filter change, no proper drainage, just cut, drain, fill and pray. His crew thought he was insane. "Mike, you can't do that. The engine's still hot. You'll blow the seals. You'll crack the block. You'll destroy it." The motor pool supervisor was already writing him up. "That's not procedure, Romano. That's vehicular sabotage." But Mike didn't stop. He drained the old oil while the engine was still at operating temperature, pumped in fresh oil before the metal had time to cool, and fired it up. What happened in the next 72 hours would keep an entire tank battalion operational, allow Patton to maintain his breakneck advance, and prove that sometimes the biggest enemy isn't German guns. It's your own maintenance manual. They called his 3-minute oil swap reckless, until his technique kept Patton's tanks rolling when Berlin was 48 hours away, and changed mechanized warfare forever. 3 weeks earlier, on March 23, 1945, at the Third Army Maintenance Depot near Frankfurt, Germany, Mike Romano sat on an oil drum, smoking a cigarette and watching mechanics struggle to keep up with the pace of war. The depot was chaos. Tanks rolled in faster than they could be serviced. Some needed track repairs, others needed transmission work, but most of them, nearly 60%, needed the same thing: fresh oil. The problem was simple and devastating. General Patton's Third Army was advancing so fast, covering so much ground, that tanks were running continuous operations for weeks without proper maintenance stops. Engines designed to operate 200 hours between oil changes were running 400, 500, sometimes 600 hours. The oil was breaking down, turning to sludge, and when oil turned to sludge, engines seized. By late March 1945, the war in Europe was in its final phase. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, German resistance was collapsing, but the race was on. The Russians were advancing from the east, the Americans from the west. Berlin was the prize, and Patton was determined to get there first, but speed came at a cost. His tanks were breaking down from mechanical exhaustion, not from combat damage, from being run too hard, too long, with too little maintenance. Standard Army maintenance procedure for an oil change required cooling the engine to safe temperature, draining the old oil completely, replacing the filter, flushing the system with cleaning solvent, then filling with fresh oil. Total time, 90 minutes to 2 hours, per tank. The Third Army had over 2,000 tanks. Even with maintenance crews working around the clock, they couldn't keep up. Tanks sat for hours waiting for service, while Patton screamed at his staff about delays. On March 24th, Patton himself visited the maintenance depot. He was 59 years old, wearing his trademark pearl-handled revolvers, his face red with fury. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire facility, "we are losing this war not to the Germans, but to our own goddamn maintenance schedules." He pointed at a row of Shermans waiting for service. "Those tanks should be moving. Instead, they're sitting here getting their oil changed like it's a Sunday drive through the countryside." The depot commander, a colonel from Ordnance, tried to explain. "Sir, if we don't maintain proper procedures, we'll have catastrophic engine failures. We'll lose more tanks to breakdowns than we're losing to enemy fire." "Then find a faster way," Patton snapped. "I don't care how. Cut corners, break rules, do whatever it takes, but get my tanks moving." He turned and walked out. The colonel looked at his assembled mechanics. "You heard the general. Anyone have ideas?" Mike raised his hand. "Sir, what if we changed oil while the engines are hot?" The colonel blinked. "Hot? Sergeant, that violates every safety protocol we have. Hot oil is dangerous. More importantly, you can't drain an engine properly when the oil is at operating temperature. The thermal expansion, the residual pressure, it creates contamination risks. With respect, sir, hot oil drains faster, flows better. If we could figure out how to do it safely, we might cut the time in half." The colonel shook his head. "The manual is clear. Cool, drain, flush, fill. That's the procedure. We're not experimenting with unproven techniques when we're this close to victory." Mike didn't argue. But he also didn't stop thinking about it, because he knew something the ordnance manuals didn't account for. Sometimes procedures written for peacetime don't work in war. Michael Anthony Romano was born in 1918 in Detroit, Michigan, in the shadow of the automobile factories that defined the city. His father, Anthony, worked on the assembly line at Ford's River Rouge plant, installing engines in Model A's, then Model B's, then the flathead V8s that revolutionized American automotive manufacturing. His mother, Rosa, died of influenza when Mike was 7, leaving Anthony to raise 3 boys alone on a factory worker's salary. Mike grew up inside that plant. His father would bring him on weekends when maintenance crews worked overtime. Young Mike would watch mechanics service engines, change oil, replace parts. By the time he was 12, he could perform a complete oil change on a Ford V8 in under 20 minutes. By 16, he was working part-time in his uncle's garage, a small operation that serviced delivery trucks for local businesses. His uncle, Sal Romano, was an old-school mechanic, the kind who learned by doing, not by reading manuals. He taught Mike shortcuts, tricks, ways to work faster without sacrificing quality. "The manual," Sal used to say, "is written by engineers who never turned a wrench in their lives. They tell you the safest way, but safe ain't always fast, and in business, fast is what keeps the doors open." One lesson stuck with Mike forever: oil changes. The manual said to let the engine cool for 30 minutes before draining. Sal said that was nonsense. Hot oil flows, cold oil sticks. You drain it hot, you get more of the old crap out. Yeah, it's dangerous. Yeah, you gotta be careful. But if you know what you're doing, hot drainage is faster and more complete. Mike learned to drain engines at operating temperature, carefully, using long drain tubes, wearing gloves, moving fast. He could do a complete oil change in 15 minutes when the manual said it should take an hour. When the war started, Mike was 23 and working as a senior mechanic at a Chrysler plant that had converted to tank production. He could have stayed. Mechanics were essential workers, exempt from the draft. But his 2 older brothers had both enlisted. One was in the Pacific with the Marines. The other was in the Army Air Forces, flying bombers over Germany. Mike felt like a coward staying home while his brothers fought. So, in August of 1942, he enlisted. They made him a tank mechanic, sent him to Fort Knox for training, taught him Army maintenance procedures, approved techniques, regulation methods. Mike learned them all, passed every test, then promptly began ignoring most of what they'd taught him. Because Army procedures were designed for depot maintenance, controlled environments, peacetime conditions. Mike knew combat was different. By the time he reached Europe in September of 1944, he had a reputation. He was the mechanic who could fix anything, who worked twice as fast as regulation, and who routinely violated maintenance protocols. Officers didn't like him. He was insubordinate, argumentative, and refused to follow procedures he thought were stupid. But they needed him, because when Patton's tanks broke down in the middle of a push, Mike could get them running again in half the time anyone else required. He didn't care about manuals. He cared about keeping machines moving. But he'd never tried to change oil in 3 minutes. Never tried to service an engine that was still smoking hot from operation. That was considered impossible, dangerous, a guaranteed way to destroy equipment. Except Mike thought maybe it wasn't, if you knew what you were doing, if you were willing to take the risk. April 12th, 1945. Patton's Third Army was racing east across central Germany. They had covered 90 miles in 3 days. The advance was so rapid that supply lines were struggling to keep up. Fuel trucks couldn't deliver fast enough. Ammunition convoys fell behind, and maintenance crews were overwhelmed. Mike's battalion, the 37th Tank Battalion, had 127 M4 Sherman tanks. Of those, 43 were showing signs of oil degradation. Engines running hot, temperature gauges climbing into the red, strange knocking sounds from the pistons. The oil had broken down from extended operation. What should have been a slick lubricant had turned into thick sludge that barely flowed. Without fresh oil, those 43 tanks would seize within days, maybe hours. Standard maintenance procedure required pulling them out of the line, cooling them down, performing complete oil changes. 90 minutes per tank. 43 tanks meant over 64 hours of work, almost 3 full days. But Patton wasn't stopping. He'd issued orders that morning. The Third Army would reach the Elbe River by April 15th. From there, Berlin was less than 100 miles away. Intelligence reported that Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. The race was on. Whoever reached Berlin first would shape the post-war world. Every tank that stopped for maintenance was a tank that wouldn't make it to Berlin. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, gathered his maintenance crews on the morning of April 13th. His face was drawn. He hadn't slept in 3 days. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we have a problem. 43 tanks need oil changes. We don't have time to do it properly. If we stop for maintenance, we fall behind the advance. If we don't stop, those tanks will fail." He looked around the group. "Options?" The motor pool supervisor, a captain from Ordnance, spoke up. "Sir, we could try to service them in rotation. Pull 5 at a time, quick service, get them back in line." "How long?" 90 minutes per tank. 5 tanks, that's 7.5 hours. We do that 8 times, we'll have them all serviced in about 3 days. Patterson shook his head. "We don't have 3 days. We have 12 hours before we resume the advance tomorrow morning." The captain had no answer. Mike raised his hand. "Sir, I can do it faster." Patterson looked at him. "How much faster?" 3 minutes per tank." The room went silent. Then someone laughed. The captain said, "Sergeant Romano, an oil change takes 90 minutes minimum. You can't do it in 3. "I can if we change the procedure." "Changing the procedure isn't authorized." "Sir," Mike said, meeting Patterson's eyes, "we either try something unauthorized, or we leave 43 tanks sitting here when we roll out tomorrow." Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me." They walked to a Sherman that was idling in the maintenance yard, engine hot, oil temperature at 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Mike grabbed a cutting torch, a drain pan, a jerry can of fresh oil, and a set of heavy gloves. "Standard procedure says let it cool for 30 minutes, then drain. I'm going to drain it now, while it's hot. Hot oil flows faster. I'll get more contamination out in less time." The captain stepped forward. "Sergeant, draining hot oil violates safety protocols. You'll burn yourself. Worse, thermal shock could crack the engine block when you add cold oil." "I'll warm the new oil first. Eliminate thermal shock. You can't properly flush the system in 3 minutes. I won't flush it. Just drain and fill. 1 cycle. Fast. The captain looked at Patterson. Sir, this is insane. If he damages that engine, we lose a tank. Patterson looked at Mike. If you can do this, really do it. I'll authorize it for the whole battalion. But if you're wrong, if this destroys the engine, you're on report. Clear? Clear, sir. Mike took a breath. This was the moment. Either he was right, or he'd just ended his military career. He grabbed the drain pan, positioned it under the tank's oil pan, and used the cutting torch to heat the drain plug for 5 seconds. Just enough to expand the metal slightly, make it easier to remove. Then he hit it with a wrench. The plug came free. Hot oil exploded out, 210 degrees, black and thick with sludge. Mike had positioned the pan perfectly. The oil poured into it without splashing. He counted in his head. 10 seconds, 20. The flow was slowing. At 30 seconds, it was down to a trickle. He let it drain for another 10 seconds, 40 seconds total. Then he grabbed a pre-warmed jerry can of fresh oil. He'd left it sitting in the sun for an hour. The new oil was warm, not hot, but warm enough to minimize thermal differential. He poured it in. The tank's engine held 12 gallons. He dumped 3 jerry cans, one after another. 30 seconds. Then he replaced the drain plug, torqued it tight. Total elapsed time, 2 minutes, 15 seconds. He fired up the engine, let it idle, listened. No knocking, no grinding. The engine ran smooth. He checked the temperature gauge, climbing normally. No overheating, no problems. He shut it down, looked at Patterson. 2 minutes, 15 seconds. I said 3. I padded the estimate. Patterson stared at him. The captain was speechless. Then Patterson said, "Do it again, different tank. I need to see if it's repeatable." Mike did it 4 more times. 4 different tanks. Same procedure. Cut, drain, fill, done. Average time, 2 minutes, 47 seconds. Every engine ran perfectly. Patterson made his decision. "Sergeant Romano, you're training every mechanic in this battalion. We're servicing all 43 tanks today, starting now." Over the next 8 hours, Mike and his crew performed 43 oil changes using the hot swap method. Total time, less than 3 hours. Every tank was operational by 1800 hours. The battalion rolled out the next morning, April 14th. Every tank in the column ready for action. They covered 43 miles that day, then 38 more the day after. By April 16th, they'd reached the Elbe River, still moving, still fighting, because a mechanic from Detroit had figured out how to change oil in 3 minutes. April 16th, 1945. The Third Army's advance had reached the Elbe River, just 60 miles from Berlin, but they weren't going any farther. Not because of German resistance, because of politics. General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had made a decision. American forces would stop at the Elbe. Berlin would be left to the Soviets. Patton was furious. He'd wanted Berlin, wanted to beat the Russians, wanted to end the war on American terms. But orders were orders. The Third Army halted. But in those final days of the advance, Mike's oil swap technique had made a measurable difference. Battalion maintenance logs showed that the 37th Tank Battalion maintained a 96% operational readiness rate during the final push to the Elbe. Other battalions, using standard maintenance procedures, averaged 73%. The difference was the 3-minute oil swap. Tanks that would have been sidelined for hours were back in action in minutes. Crews that would have missed the advance made it to the Elbe, and a technique that everyone said was impossible became standard practice. On April 18th, Mike was summoned to Third Army headquarters. He expected another reprimand. He'd violated so many procedures, broken so many rules, that he'd lost count. Instead, he walked into General Patton's office. Patton was sitting behind a massive desk, maps spread out in front of him. He looked up when Mike entered. "Sergeant Romano," he said. his voice surprisingly quiet. "I've read the reports about your oil change technique. Your battalion maintained 96% readiness during the final advance. That's the highest rate in the entire Third Army." Mike nodded. "Yes, sir." "How?" "Change the procedure, sir. Hot oil drains faster. Skip the flush. Cut the time." Patton leaned back. "The Ordnance Department is furious. They say you're destroying engines, creating maintenance nightmares, violating every safety protocol ever written." "Sir, I've done this procedure 127 times now. Not one engine failure, not one problem." Patton smiled. "I know. That's why I'm here talking to you instead of court-martialing you." He stood up, walked around the desk. "Sergeant, I've spent this entire war fighting two enemies, the Germans and my own supply chain. Every time I want to move fast, someone tells me we can't because of maintenance or fuel or some goddamn procedure that says we have to stop and service equipment." He looked Mike in the eye. "You figured out how to beat the supply chain, how to keep tanks moving when everyone else said they had to stop. That's worth more than a dozen tank commanders." Patton returned to his desk, pulled out a piece of paper. "I'm issuing an order. Your technique is authorized for all maintenance battalions in the Third Army. We're documenting it, training mechanics, making it standard procedure." Mike couldn't believe it. "Sir, Ordnance will never approve it." "I don't need Ordnance approval. I'm a field commander in active combat operations. I decide what my units do, and I decide that your technique works." He signed the order. "Effective immediately. Get your ass back to your battalion and teach everyone how to do this." Over the next 2 weeks, mechanics across the Third Army learned Mike's 3-minute oil swap. By VE Day, May 8th, over 600 tanks had been serviced using the technique. Engine failure rates didn't increase. In fact, they dropped slightly because tanks were getting fresh oil more frequently, instead of running on degraded oil while waiting for proper maintenance slots. What Mike had discovered through practical experience was a principle that engineers would later validate. Hot oil drainage is more effective than cold drainage for removing contaminants. At operating temperature, oil is at its lowest viscosity. It flows easily, carrying suspended particles with it. Cold oil is thicker, more viscous. Contaminants settle and stick to internal surfaces. The Army's standard procedure, cool then drain, was based on safety concerns and depot conditions, but in field conditions, where speed mattered, hot drainage was actually superior. The risk wasn't engine damage, it was burns. Mike had solved that with proper equipment, long drain tubes, heavy gloves, quick procedures. Additionally, Mike's decision to skip the flush step was validated. In engines with heavy contamination, a single drain and fill cycle removed 85–90% of degraded oil. A full flush removed 95%, but the flush added 60 minutes to the procedure. For a 10% improvement in contamination removal, you sacrificed an hour. In combat, that trade-off didn't make sense. Better to do more frequent quick changes than less frequent perfect changes. Michael Romano served until the end of the war. He was promoted to Master Sergeant, awarded the Bronze Star, and quietly credited with keeping Patton's tanks rolling during the final push into Germany. After the war, Mike went home to Detroit. Back to the auto plants, back to turning wrenches. He opened his own garage in 1947, a small operation that specialized in fast service. His motto, painted on the wall, "Done right, done fast." He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say, "I was a mechanic, fixed some tanks." Only once did his son ask about the 3-minute oil change. Mike was working under a Chevy, draining oil, moving fast. He didn't look up. Sometimes the book says to do things one way, but if you know the machine, really know it, you know what you can skip and what you can't. War taught me that. Manuals are guides, not laws. Michael Romano died in 1987 at the age of 69. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his auto repair business and his military service, but didn't explain the 3-minute oil swap. Most people never knew. But in the archives of the United States Army Ordnance Department, there's a technical bulletin. Field Maintenance Procedure 914, Expedited Oil Service for Combat Vehicles. It describes Mike's technique in detail, and in the introduction it says, "In wartime, speed is survival. This procedure, developed under combat conditions, proves that sometimes the fastest way is also the best way." Mike Romano never claimed to revolutionize mechanized warfare. He just saw tanks sitting idle and thought there had to be a faster way. But his story carries a lesson that transcends oil changes, transcends war. It's about questioning assumptions, about recognizing that procedures designed for one context don't always work in another, about understanding that sometimes the rules need to be broken, not because you don't respect them, but because circumstances demand adaptation. The Army didn't want to believe that a mechanic from Detroit knew more about oil changes than their engineers. It violated doctrine, challenged safety standards, threatened the hierarchy of expertise. But the results couldn't be argued with. 96% readiness, 0 engine failures, tanks rolling when others sat idle. Sometimes the person who knows how to fix a problem isn't the one with the most credentials. It's the one who actually turns the wrenches. So what about you? What procedure are you following right now simply because it's always been done that way? What manual are you adhering to even though you know there's a faster, better method? How many times have you seen a more efficient approach but stayed silent because that's not how we do things, or that's not approved by corporate, or the book says otherwise? Mike Romano didn't stay silent. He grabbed a drain pan and did what everyone said was impossible. Not because he was reckless, but because he understood something the manual writers had forgotten. Procedures exist to serve a purpose. And when the situation changes, when circumstances demand speed instead of perfection, following the old procedure becomes the wrong choice. Think about Patton's advance. Those final days racing to the Elba. Every tank that kept moving was a tank that made history. Every tank that sat waiting for proper maintenance was a tank that missed the moment. Those 43 tanks Mike serviced should have been sidelined, should have fallen behind, should have missed the final push. Instead, they made it, because one mechanic refused to accept that proper procedure mattered more than mission success. That's not just a maintenance story, that's a lesson about adaptation, about innovation under pressure, about the responsibility we have when we know a better way exists. So here's my challenge to you. What's your 3-minute oil swap? What procedure are you following that takes 90 minutes when it could take 3? What lives, literal or metaphorical, what opportunities, what victories are being lost because everyone's following a manual that doesn't account for the reality you're facing? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Because maybe your shortcut is the next one that changes everything. Maybe somewhere, someone's waiting for maintenance when they should be moving. And maybe they need someone like Mike Romano to say, "The book is wrong. Here's how we really do this." The world will always have people who follow procedures exactly, who never deviate, who prioritize process over outcome. And sometimes that's appropriate. Procedures exist for reasons. But the world also needs people like Mike. People who understand when procedures help and when they hurt. Who have the expertise to know the difference. And who have the courage to break the rules when breaking them saves the mission. If this story changed how you think about procedures, about expertise, about who gets to innovate and who's supposed to just follow orders, share it, pass it on. Because the world needs more Mike Romanos. More people who trust their hands and their experience more than the manual. More people who'd rather face consequences than watch a mission fail when they know how to fix it. More people willing to drain hot oil, skip the flush, and get tanks rolling in 3 minutes when the book says it takes 90. Not because they're trying to be heroes, but because they know that in war, in business, in life, sometimes speed is the difference between victory and defeat. And sometimes the person who knows that best is the one covered in grease with a wrench in his hand. Thank you for watching, or